This morning, we are celebrating another successful WOW event, thanks to the hard work of many people. The kids had fun with activities ranging from arts and crafts to those scavenger hunts that I mentioned earlier. And I think the adults, for the most part, had fun leading them. We shared in puppet shows while we ate together and enjoyed time just playing out on the playground when the weather permitted. But each week we began our time together talking about how God's love for us is constant and what that means. The first week we discussed that God loves us so much that we can never lose that love. The second week we explored the parable of the Good Samaritan and talked about how to share that love with others. The third week we talked about how love is an action, not just a feeling. And that's what Jesus asked us to share. And then the final week, we looked at the part of the gospel passage that we just read. Specifically, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. I expected that this would be one of the more difficult ones for the children, especially as I explained what it meant. So I really wasn't very surprised when I hadn't gotten much further than just reading that verse when one of the kids blurted out, "That doesn't make much sense." After all, that's the reaction of many adults to this passage. People seem to understand that when Jesus says, "Do good to those who harm you," he isn't talking about that neighbor who annoys you by waking you up mowing the lawn early in the morning, or that person at work who steals from your lunch. We know he's referring to more than just that person you avoid, because you know you're going to have to listen to his opinions again on everything wrong in the world and how to fix it, and they are the direct opposite of anything you believe. These situations are good starting points for putting Jesus' words into practice. But most of us understand that they are not his ultimate end. No, when Jesus says enemies, he means enemies, those who have or wish to harm us. So some here argue that Jesus' command is naive and ignores how the world actually works. They argue that if you were to love your enemies, they would continue to take advantage of you. Let someone hit you again after they've hit you the first time, and that only emboldens them to do it again, if not to you, to some other person. Giving more to someone who steals only invites them to continue stealing from others. So others argue that this is what Jesus meant, but that's only about personal, one-on-one relationships, and that it isn't to be applied on the global stage to those who invade nations or commit atrocities. They argue that if we were to do this, that would allow evil to triumph and leave the vulnerable helpless. Enemies are enemies for a reason, they argue. And as if all that didn't make this passage difficult enough, it has been layered throughout history and twisted and told that some victims of oppression and abuse, that this tells them that they need to stay where they are, to turn the other cheek, that they're to remain suffering victims because one day they will receive their reward. Yet, as Walter Wink points out, this is a gross misrepresentation of this passage and what Jesus is trying to teach here. Jesus is not encouraging submission to evil. That would run counter to everything he said and did. He is, rather, warning against responding to evil in kind and letting the oppressor set the terms of our oppression. His original audience would have understood this. For in the society of Jesus' time, turning your cheek to one who had struck you on one cheek, or giving your shirt as well as your coat, would have signified that you were responding in a way similar to the marchers in the civil rights movement, kneeling before the fire hoses and the snarling dogs. Those acts would have highlighted the cruelty of the situation without resorting to violence. So Jesus urges here an alternative response, whether it be using meek submission or turning violence for violence, which only turns the victim into another oppressor. Jesus' way is a response that puts dignity and control back in the hands of the intended victim by refusing to be identified and defined by the enemy or the aggressor. It reflects the vision of the world that Jesus teaches and lives out, that shows God's love and grace towards us while recognizing each person's worth. But it's also a vision that crashes up against prevailing cultural values that we must have strength through might, of retribution, and even of seeking justice through punishment. So while we may agree that this is a great ideal and wish the world did work this way, most of us struggle to live out these words. Martha Mullen is one person who engages in that struggle. She lives in Virginia and is a mental health counselor as well as a member of the United Methodist Church. After the death of one of the suspects of the Boston Marathon bombings, she heard how his body languished in a funeral home when cemetery after cemetery and then community after community denied his family burial. Some of them feared protests, others feared that his site would become a shrine, but many just didn't want this man who had inflicted so much harm and pain anywhere near them. Small protests had started to make the news that were being held outside the funeral home that had agreed to accept the body and was trying to arrange for its burial. Mullen was horrified by the bombing and the extent of the injuries. She didn't have any sympathy for the reasons the bombers used to justify their attacks. Still, as she listened at the local Starbucks to news of the protests around the funeral home, she felt bad first for the funeral director when she recalled, Jesus says I'm to love my neighbor and to love our enemies, and concluded, maybe I'm the one person who needs to do something. Working with various faith organizations, and finally with the Islamic Funeral Services of Virginia, she helped coordinate a funeral plot at a Virginia cemetery. It was an interfaith effort, she said. We needed to bury his body and move forward. It was distracting from the healing that needed to take place. But that wasn't how everyone else saw it. Many Boston residents were upset that the body had been given a proper burial. And some of the neighbors to the cemetery were outraged. Virginian law officials complained that they had not been notified previous to this happening and searched for any violation of the burial laws there so that they could exhume the body. Many objected to someone who had caused so much harm and grief being given a respectful resting place, and especially to Mullen's part in making it happen. And a few postings on the internet expressed as much rage against Mullen as they did towards the bombers themselves. As a native Boston area resident, I could empathize with those who objected to his burial after all the pain that he had caused. I myself had spent a few anxious hours that day worrying about my sister-in-law, who was attending the marathon at the finish line before I heard from my brother that she was okay. So I don't judge those who are outraged by Mullen's actions, nor will I say that they have to forgive. But there was one way I could relate to Mullen. When I read of the initial protests outside the funeral home and the repeated refusals to accept the body for burial, I too had thought of this passage, specifically of Jesus' words, to do good to those who hate you, and was reminded just how hard that really is. I was glad that someone was able to live out these words of Jesus, but I still wonder if I could do the same. And so at times like that, I wonder if those who say that Jesus is being naive are right. Maybe those who say that Jesus was only referring to our personal relationships with each other and never intended that this could be applied in a global sense understand this correctly. For how could this work in the real world? Then I recall that we already have an example of just how this works. After the end of apartheid in South Africa, Nelson Mandela feared that those who had been the victims of brutality would resort to the same sort of violence against their attackers. So to counter this, he asked Bishop Desmond Tutu to run a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to both bring out the truth and provide opportunities for healing. Their task was to listen as those who perpetuated the crimes admitted responsibility and detailed them to both the commission and their victims. They could then request amnesty from the commission to consider, which the commission considered granting after the victims had had a chance to share the story of the pain they endured. In his book, Rumors, Philip Yancey described one such hearing. A police officer by the name of Vanderbroek told of how he and his fellow officers had shot an 18-year-old, then burnt the body. 8 years later, they went back, took the father, and forced his wife to watch as he was burned alive. After hearing Vanderbroek, his victim's mother and wife were asked by the commission what she wanted. Mr. Vanderbroek took all my family away from me, and I still have a lot of love to give, she reportedly replied. Twice a month, I would like him to come, spend a day with me so I can be a mother to him. I would like to embrace him so he may know my forgiveness is real. Now, most requests for amnesty didn't result in such generous reconciliations. Most reflected the difficulty that comes from the struggle of trying to love our enemies. It's difficult to forgive them, never mind wish the best for them. But I believe that we are to wrestle with this and how we see our enemies, following Jesus' example. And as Jesus did, we are to rely on God's grace for both our enemies and for when we fail and fall short. As I said earlier, when I started talking about this passage to the kids at WOW last week, I wasn't overly surprised when one of them declared, "But that doesn't make sense." So I asked him to explain why he thought it didn't, expecting something along the lines of, "You would be hurt again," or any of the objections that I've talked about earlier, of course, at the level of a child. Instead, he bowled me over by answering, Because if you love your enemies, they're not your enemies after all. Maybe the children do get it better than us. Amen. The gospel lesson this morning is a difficult one to live out, but it is one that we are called to struggle with and to try to do each and every day of our lives. But one of the things I told the kids as we finished up the lessons on that last day is that the 4 things that we had talked about weren't a straight line that led one to another, but that they were a circle. And so that as we tried to love our enemies, we had God's love to rely on. And if we did fail, to remember our first lesson, that God's love can never be lost to us. God is always faithful. Depart in peace to do God's will. Walk ever in Christ's light. Through Christ you are a child of God, who guides us day and night. Depart in peace.